Have you ever wondered what lies behind the walls of restaurants and cafes where we casually go to dine or grab a cup of coffee? Maybe it's a place that feels familiar to you, cozy, with soft lighting and the smell of freshly prepared food. But what if those facades something much darker? Have you ever had moments when a waiter seemed just a little bit off? Or maybe you felt an inexplicable sense of unease in an otherwise empty restaurant. That warm, inviting atmosphere could be a mere illusion, masking something terrifying. Today, we're going to tell you 3 unbelievable and chilling stories that happen to everyday people. After hearing them, you'll never look at restaurants the same way again. Jennifer and Tom loved spending quiet evenings together, choosing small, cozy restaurants. This time, they decided to try a new spot that had recently opened near their home. From the very beginning, something felt off. The restaurant was unusually empty for a Friday night. The only waiter greeted them with an unnatural smile that immediately made Jennifer uneasy, but she decided not to dwell on it. Tom joked that maybe the place was new and hadn't gained popularity yet, and that they were just some of the first customers. They sat by the window, where a light drizzle was falling outside. At first glance, the place seemed cozy, soft lighting, wooden furniture, pleasant music. But the longer Jennifer stayed there, the more anxious she became. A strange feeling that someone was watching them crept over her. Half an hour passed, and their order still hadn't arrived. Tom began to get irritated and called for the waiter. When he came over, his smile looked even stranger, almost as if it was glued to his face. But that wasn't what scared Jennifer. She suddenly realized that the restaurant, aside from their table, had plunged into complete silence. It felt as though they were the only guests, even though just a few minutes ago there were clearly people at other tables. When the food finally arrived, Jennifer's stomach knotted with an inexplicable dread. The waiter once again disappeared into the dark hall, and just at that moment, the lights went out. For a moment, there was complete darkness, broken only by the sound of rain outside the window. Then footsteps. Someone was slowly approaching. Tom tried to turn on the flashlight on his phone, but the screen flickered and showed static. Suddenly, the silhouette of the waiter appeared in the dark, but his movements were jerky, almost mechanical. When the lights came back on, their food was gone from the table. Instead, strange symbols were carved into the surface, symbols they hadn't noticed before. Tom rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge lock. Jennifer, panicking, tried to find another way out, but suddenly strange powder began to fall from the ceiling, stinging her eyes. They both stood up abruptly, but that's when they noticed people around them. Strange, motionless figures with masks on their faces. These figures didn't speak, but it felt as though they were watching. One of them reached out toward Tom, and he screamed. Jennifer lunged for the door, but her hand stuck to the handle, as if some invisible force was holding her. Suddenly, she felt something cold touch her back. Turning around, she locked eyes with the empty gaze of one of the masks. Marcus was an architect, and his work often kept him late. One night, after a long day, he decided to stop by a small 24-hour cafe near his office to grab a quick bite and finish a project. It was his favorite spot, quiet and almost always empty. But that night, as Marcus walked inside, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The cafe was unusually quiet. Even the usual background music wasn't playing. The waiter stood behind the counter, wiping cups, but his movements seemed strangely slow and his eyes vacant. Marcus took his usual seat by the window and ordered his typical meal, a strong coffee and a sandwich. When the waiter brought his order, his hands were shaking slightly, and he wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes, as if his mind was somewhere else. Marcus didn't think much of it and started eating, trying to focus on his project. But within minutes, he noticed something odd. First, there were strange rustling sounds coming from the corners of the cafe, and then soft footsteps, even though no one was around. The lights in the cafe began to flicker, and in the darkened corners, shadows started to form. These shadows slowly became more defined, taking the shapes of people. One of the shadows approached Marcus's table, and as it neared, he felt a cold touch on his hand, but there was no one in front of him. Marcus jumped to his feet and headed for the door, but it was locked. He turned to call for the waiter, but the man stood behind the counter with the same frozen smile, his eyes now empty like a puppet's. The lights in the cafe went out completely, and in the silence, there was a metallic scraping sound, like someone was trying to break through the door from the outside. A flash of light from a passing car briefly illuminated the cafe, and Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. The tables were now occupied. People, who had appeared out of nowhere, sat at each table, their faces twisted and distorted. One of them slowly stood up and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Lisa often visited a small cafe on the corner to unwind after work. She loved the place for its cozy atmosphere and soft lighting, which made her feel at peace. One evening after a long day, she decided to stop by again. It was drizzling outside and she was ready to just relax in the warmth and quiet. When Lisa walked in, she immediately noticed something had changed. The cafe was empty except for a strange woman sitting at a table in the back. This woman didn't take her eyes off Lisa, and her gaze was so piercing that it made Lisa uncomfortable. The waiter, usually friendly and smiling, looked gloomy and troubled this time. He silently took her order and left without a word. Lisa settled by the window and waited for her lat, but the strange feeling of unease wouldn't go away. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The woman at the back table hadn't stopped staring. After a few minutes, the woman stood up and approached Lisa, whispering, "They are watching you." Before Lisa could respond, the woman disappeared. She simply vanished into thin air. Lisa tried to stand, but her legs felt glued to the floor. She looked around and noticed that all the mirrors in the cafe had fogged up. Strange words started to appear on the fogged surfaces. "They are coming for you." Her heart raced. The waiter still hadn't returned, and the cafe was sinking into a strange haze. Lisa started to panic, feeling that the situation was growing more sinister by the second. From the dark corners of the cafe, shadowy figures began to emerge. Their faces were blurry, and their hands slowly reached toward her. Lisa tried to grab her phone to call for help, but the screen wouldn't turn on. Then footsteps, slow and echoing. The waiter approached Lisa, but now his face was distorted, almost melting. He placed a bill in front of her. Lisa looked at it. Instead of numbers, there was one word: death. Emily was a vegan and took her dining choices very seriously. One evening, she discovered a new vegan cafe near her home. She had never noticed it before, even though she had lived in the area for years. The cafe's name was written on a small sign, and the light above the door flickered, but inside, a warm glow created a welcoming atmosphere. Emily decided to step in and try something new. As soon as she entered, she was greeted by the waiter, a tall man with pale skin and hollow eyes. He didn't say a word, merely gesturing for her to take a seat. Emily sat by the window and looked around. The cafe was small, but at first glance it seemed cozy, soft chairs, fresh flowers on the tables. However, it was strange that no one else was there, despite it being evening. Maybe it's new, Emily thought, brushing off the empty tables. The waiter appeared again, and this time Emily noticed his movements were jerky like a broken robot. He handed her the menu, and she realized the writing was in a strange, hard-to-read font. When Emily asked what he recommended, the waiter gave her a look that sent shivers down her spine. His eyes seemed bottomless, as if he could see right through her. Despite the oddness, Emily placed her order. Time passed, but her meal never arrived. The eerie silence in the cafe began to press on her. Every sound, whether the creak of a chair or the drip of rain outside, grew louder and more insistent. Emily decided to head to the kitchen to find out what was going on with her order. She walked through the dining area and entered the door marked staff only. What she saw on the other side made her blood run cold. The kitchen was completely empty, but handprints covered the walls and floor, as if someone had been trying to escape. The smell of rot filled the air, making Emily feel nauseous. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her and turned around. The waiter stood in the shadows, quietly watching her, but his face had changed. His features were harsher, and his skin seemed to be peeling off his bones. Emily ran back to the dining area, but the lights suddenly went out. In the darkness, she heard a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Footsteps drew closer, and Emily felt something brush her shoulder. When she turned, she saw the entire room was now filled with people, dead, with twisted faces. They were slowly advancing toward her, their hands reaching for her neck. She rushed to the door, but it was locked. The whisper grew louder, turning into a high-pitched screech. The waiter, now barely human, slowly approached her, his eyes burning with hatred. Emily grabbed a nearby chair and threw it at the window, but the glass didn't break. She was trapped. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on and everything vanished: the waiter, the dead, the sounds. The cafe was empty and quiet once again. But as Emily ran out to the street, she looked back and saw that the sign above the door had gone dark, and an old, rusty lock hung on the door, as if the cafe had been closed for years. Did you enjoy the story? We hope you felt the eerie atmosphere that can lurk in the most ordinary places. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and leave a comment. We're ready to release more chilling tales if you're up for it.